Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here, and today it is once again time for some more philosophical pontification about guitar nerddom. And today's video is centered around a phrase that you might hear on online forums or especially in musician interviews, and that is the song in the guitar, or as I'll be kind of pivoting into the song in the gear, the song in the amp, the song in the pedal, and what exactly that means and how that phrase has kind of become more and more true to me, and it really identified itself in the past year or so, especially while working on music. In the latter example, you might hear a musician say, I didn't really write this riff, I just picked up this guitar and it automatically came to me. It's like the song was in the guitar and all I had to do was pick it up. One of my favorite examples is Devin Townsend, who recalls tracking Ocean Machine and writing most of City on a black ESP Explorer type guitar, set neck, Gibson scale length, EMG equipped, but then switched to a Telecaster style guitar, still EMG humbuckers, but Fender scale bolt-on neck. And upon picking that instrument up and sitting down to write material, most of Infinity just kind of happened, especially the opener Truth, which he recalls thinking was some divine inspiration at the time. But automatic writing, as it is called, is something that does happen with a lot of us, and especially, at least in my experience, happens when you get yourself outside of your normal comfort zone or pick up a new instrument or explore a new sound. So that to me is what the song in the guitar means, and it extends to all guitar gear in my experience. I write very different things accidentally at that. When I plug into a more Marshall-inspired sound than I do a Mesa-inspired sound, in the same way that picking up two different guitars, however slightly different they might be, oftentimes inspires different results. I can pick up, two Gibson scale length instruments, and just depending on the size and the feel and the sound the pickups are emanating, it oftentimes makes me play very different material. And all those things combine into a cohesive experience that makes me want to play certain things on that instrument. For example, with the Wild Audio Blood Eagle, it's kind of that aforementioned Explorer heavy metal setup. It has a very particular feel that even beyond its tonal signature makes me want to play stuff that's in a very specific region of heavy metal, whereas I can pick up the SG, which is a thinner guitar, lighter guitar, has different tonal qualities, passive pickups, more vintage style stuff, and I can make it chug, I can make it sound really brutal, but it makes me want to play more vintage inspired rock and roll, and even on the same tunings, it makes me play different stuff. And that's just in the 6-string realm of things. You start getting into different tunings and pickup combinations and fan fret or not, or different scale lengths, especially with extended range guitars. And that's why I can write material that goes from the Cedarham project that I've already released to stuff I'm working on now. So none of this is particularly earth-shattering. I'm sure most of you have experienced something similar when switching between different guitars or rigs, whether it be writing your own material or playing someone else's. But I wanted to cover a different level of this conversation, one that I think is more nuanced, and things that have revealed themselves to me in the past year or so working on the material I am, and working on a lot of the videos I have for this channel, because I've been, as most of you know, a huge proponent of amp modeling software, amp modeling hardware. And as I've said before, and no doubt will continue to say countless times, I believe the digital world is the best sound per dollar that a guitarist or indeed any musician can achieve, whether we're talking about a hardware unit specific for your instrument or not specific, oftentimes being the best case, or plugins for a PC or Mac that you already own. And one of the things that I've touched on about amp modeling for me is that I can oftentimes make them sound damn near identical, if not completely identical on recording, if I'm shooting for that. But something I've experienced when it comes to this digital versus analog conversation is I arrive at different places, even with the same sort of tones. And I feel like this is a conversation that doesn't really get had when it comes to the arguments for or against one or the other, because I can take the Mesa Boogie Mark Series model on, say, an Axe FX, and my real Mesa Boogie Mark IV, and I'm oftentimes finding that even though they share the same sort of controls and the range is the same, obviously the pot tolerances aren't the same, and you get to things differently, they are more or less the same sounding model by the time you put them through all the same processing, but I get different sounds just based on the user experience of that. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but they do actually get different results in my experience. So For example, with the Cedarham project, I tracked that entire EP with the AX8, and I meticulously dialed in that rhythm guitar tone using that Mark IV model. Now, if I plug into my Mark IV, the actual amplifier, I can match it and get to that point. But whether it be because of my OCD and I don't like that, the bass control isn't on a round number, or because the tolerances on the slider feels a little different, I oftentimes arrive at a sound that is mostly the same and is serviceable, but one that is different even when I'm trying to play the same material. In addition to that, oftentimes this has to do as much with some of the integrated functionality of amp modeling gear that you simply don't have on a real tube amplifier or a simple tube screamer type pedal. I could always stick a graphic EQ or even a parametric EQ before or after one of these things, but it's not built into an amplifier block, or just as easy as right-clicking and adding one of those things after the fact to get into some really fine-tuned EQing or boosting an amplifier, all these things that you have at your fingertips and may not be a second thought for you on something like an Axe FX or a Helix or a Kemper or now the Quad Cortex. But if you're one that just wants to plug straight into an amplifier head, it will oftentimes inspire different sounds and you'll go after it a different way. Even if you manage to get all of your analog and digital gear sounding identical and your workflow is the same, I still have found that my practicing and tracking and monitoring and recording guitar situations are still very much different, and I prefer to use different tools for those jobs, or especially have them overlap in scenarios where it makes sense. So for instance, the Vox Cutting Edge. This is a pedal I've been playing with for several months now. I hope to do a full featured episode on this and some other gear I've missed out on last year. But this is basically like a boosted rectifier in a box, and it sounds fantastic for that. It's probably good enough to put on recording for a lot of people. Would I ever use it that way? No, not really. However, there is something to be said about this simple user interface. You got 6 knobs and that's it, versus having something that has infinite control, i.e. a Kemper or Axe FX model thereof, versus a real amplifier head, which simply doesn't have all the functionality of this, and you got to play out loud in the room or have other recording solutions. So I can oftentimes get to the same sound, or mostly the same sort of sound, something that I would play, and just be inspired because of the way I'm using it. Sometimes something in the room will sound cool or set me off a certain direction versus playing something like this through headphones or into a clean amp. Or take, for instance, my recent workflow for recording guitars either on this channel or for the EP I'm working on. There's almost no scenario, except maybe unless I have a weird pedal that's really impedance sensitive, where I just plug straight into the gear and hit record. Most of the time what you're hearing is a reamped file, because I record straight into my PC and then put it through some gear later. And that's to keep things consistent, and I don't have to do a whole lot of extra work. It allows me to change over things quicker and have better testing as a result. But oftentimes what I'm doing recently is plugging into the Kemper Profiler as my monitor sound. I'll generally get a profile of something pretty quickly that is kind of in the ballpark of what I'm playing, but not record that signal. I'm recording the DI only, so I send that out either through an auxiliary return or SPDIF, record that signal, that's my DI, and then I reamp it and get the final sound you hear later. And that works for me because it's a little inspirational in terms of how I think I'm going to be using it, but it's not the core sound at the end. Then oftentimes, on top of that, like right now for the EP, I use plugins to monitor the finished sound, something that sounds more or less like what I'll have when I use all analog gear. And I can, on the fly, change different pedal sounds or amplifier plugins, impulse responses, other effects after the fact to make sure that it sits well with the mix while not having to redo my performance. My performance is still the same. It pretty much sounds the same in terms of the play style, but just different amplifier tones. And then I can practice for when I'm eventually going to reamp, or I could use that as my final sound if I wanted to. But the point being that all these things have different roles in the way that I'm playing guitar. And here's the biggest kicker out of all this. Save for maybe 3, 4-ish, 5-ish solos or verses that I came up with rather recently, none of the core guitar material was written using any of the gear I just talked about, whether it be the real analog stuff or Kemper Profiles or VST plugins. I might have made a couple additions and some tweaks here and there, but nothing that fundamentally changed the song, because when I wrote this material several years ago, I was using a cheap pedal board and an even cheaper amplifier, and not to mention a completely different guitar. So for those of you that still remember what the title of this video is, what gives? What am I even getting at here? Well, in short, the song in the instrument, the song in the pedal, the song in the amp doesn't always translate to the song that gets played on that instrument or pedal or amp. A more recent example for me is I came up with a pretty cool riff that I like a lot playing through this Meathead fuzz clone. I will almost definitely not track that riff using this pedal, but it inspired me to play that. Why? I couldn't tell you. It was a cool, gnarly sound, but when playing that through a different kind of sound, a different amp setup, using a different guitar, I found the setup that eventually I thought, okay, I'm at home. This is where this should have been all along. It's kind of the same thing. If I wrote a riff using this cutting edge pedal, I probably wouldn't stick with that just because I wrote that material on this pedal. I found myself in this very dichotomous relationship between the way that I play guitar and write guitar material versus the way that they actually get recorded or put onto a project. I'm a very box-minded individual. I like things to go into their respective boxes, and I like those boxes to be put near other boxes on a shelf that makes sense categorically or thematically. And the way that at least I write guitar material, I can't just sit down and go, okay, I'm going to write material to put in this particular box. For me, it just kind of comes out of nowhere. And then I try to figure out where it goes after the fact. And sometimes you just can't make it fit into a pre-existing box. Sometimes you got to put it in the miscellaneous one, or sometimes you got to create a whole new one entirely and just wait until that develops into something and it's ready to come out. But to even get to that point, I've found the variety of gear, the variety of instruments, the sounds, the environments that make me want to write that stuff doesn't all end up on that same recording. And that's why I like to have a little bit of everything. So to round it back to the initial point of the song in the pedal, the song in the guitar, the song in the amplifier, the amp modeler, maybe this might sound like an addict justifying his addiction, but that is why I ultimately can't recommend to one person, you know, this is the be-all, end-all platform. This is why you have to have this pedal or you have to have this one. To me, I just kind of have to have a little bit of everything. Maybe there's some of you out there watching that just have their ducks in a row. You've got your one main guitar rig and your one guitar, and your creative juices are just always flowing and all cylinders are firing and you've got everything figured out, and good for you. If so, I wish I was there myself. But I feel like for a lot of people, whether you play one genre and one specific project or 100, it's beneficial just to try out different sounds and different instruments and different amps and different cabinets and stuff that will hopefully introduce you to a different side of things, just for something different, if for nothing else. I don't advocate change for just to change things, but for me, like I said, plugging into a different overdrive pedal or using a clean boost in front of this amplifier or combining other gear that I've already had has led to creativity that I did not expect to be there or even try for. So what am I even trying to say with this existential crisis of a video? Don't stop questioning, I guess, with all things, but especially when it comes to guitar playing, there's so many of us out there and there's a whole lot of overlap. So anything you can do to stand out or sound unique, of course, is welcome. So any way you can get there is a good thing. And I think finding the song in that particular piece of gear is a good way of going about it. Now, I'm not saying go out there and, spend $400 every day on a different pedal to try to search for riffs. But I am saying if you find yourself, experiencing writer's block or just not able to really refine riffs or solos the way that you want to, just try something different. Try something intentionally screwy. Perhaps you find that some weird big muff sound just kind of works on your technical death metal album, or you come up with a weird gear combination that doesn't sound good tonally speaking, but it makes you come up with something that you can translate into something that does sound good. And if you have the room and budget to support such a thing, and you don't have to go all out by any means, but I would suggest, because it's been helpful for me, to have different setups for everything you do. If you are a working guitarist, having your gig rig is a good way to get into that mode. But having your creative rig or your practice rig, I think, is also important to allow you to not be tied down to that mentality. Like I said, for me, it's been a particular piece of gear and a certain setup for doing one thing, and then riding has been another thing, and tracking has been another thing. And that helps me get into a certain mode. Or if that's too constricted for you, maybe just throwing out all the rules is the thing to do. So I guess the overarching point is, for me at least, I often find songs in everything, and they don't necessarily correlate to the gear that I'm playing at the time. Oftentimes it does. I'm more likely to write a rockabilly riff on a Telecaster than I am an extended range guitar, for sure, but it doesn't always work out so neatly, so don't expect it to and don't force it to. So that's one of the many reasons why I have several flavors of high gain amplifiers, a full pedal full of overdrive pedals, not because I feel like Ash Ketchum and I just got to catch them all, but because they do specific things for me, whether it be creatively or just having fun. So hopefully that makes sense for a lot of you out there, and maybe some of you sneaky guys out there can show this video to your mom and try to justify, having 50 pedals for your next Christmas, but probably isn't going to work. Anyway, thanks so very much for watching. As always, any other questions and comments, please leave them down below, and hopefully we will see you soon with some more product reviews. Thanks. Bye.